This is the story of how a venerable Cold War warrior became an unlikely ecological hero. On the 12th of February 1971, the SS Wafra, a 36,697-ton oil tanker owned by Getty Tankers, departed Ras Tanura, Saudi Arabia, loaded with 472,000 barrels of crude oil. Her destination was Cape Town, South Africa. Everything was fine until the Wafra rounded the southern tip of Africa in the early morning of the 27th of February. Suddenly, piping used to bring seawater aboard to keep the Wafra's steam turbine cool failed, causing flooding of the engine room. Without power, the Wafra drifted and sent out a mayday call for assistance. The next day, a Soviet tanker attempted to take the Wafra under tow, but failed, and her place was taken by another ship, the Pongola. By now, the Wafra was only 7 miles off treacherous Cape Agulhas, which has dangerous submerged reefs. The tow cable parted, and the huge ship smashed onto a reef on the afternoon of the 28th of February 1971, rupturing several of her massive oil storage tanks. An ecological disaster was fast shaping up as 26,000 tons of crude oil gushed into the sea. The African penguin colony at Dyer Island was inundated by 6,000 tons of oil as emergency measures began to be taken to try and contain the calamity. On the 8th of March, the wounded Wafra was dragged off the reef by a German tug, Oceanic. But she was doomed and began to break up in the heavy seas. It was imperative to prevent more oil draining from the ship, which would have blanketed a large section of the South African coastline, killing marine and bird life in vast numbers. The main section of the ship was towed 200 miles out into the ocean, leaving an oil slick 99 miles long, until positioned over the edge of the continental shelf. It was decided to sink the Wafra in the very deep water to stop oil from reaching the coast. But how to sink the Wafra quickly? The South African government decided to hand the problem over to the Air Force. In the 1970s, the South African Air Force was well equipped and extremely well trained. Its role to both protect the country from outside threats and patrol the sea for Soviet submarines. Its aircraft had also been involved in the low-intensity border war in Angola, Namibia and Zambia since 1966. At the time, it was largely equipped with British aircraft. One of its most advanced aircraft was the Blackburn Buccaneer S-50-16, purchased from the UK in 1962 before an arms embargo against South Africa was put in place. The Buccaneers were sent to sink the Wafra, armed with AS-30 anti-ship missiles. On the 10th of March 1971, the Buccaneers attacked, firing multiple missiles at the Wafra, but they did not sink her. Instead, after being hit by a total of 7 missiles, the Wafra burst into flames. But the ship showed no signs of sinking on her own. Oil continued to leak from the shattered hull into the ocean. The South African Air Force decided to change tack and try something else. It was time to deploy the venerable Avro Shackleton to finish the job. The Shackleton was a long-range maritime patrol aircraft that had first entered Royal Air Force service in 1951. The type was a development of the Avro Lincoln 4-engined heavy bomber, which first flew in 1944, itself a development of the famous Avro Lancaster bomber of dambusters fame. The Lincoln and its more famous predecessor lived on in the Shackleton's fuselage design and tail. But its 4 engines mounted 2 contra-rotating propellers each, making it a very noisy aircraft indeed. The Shackleton was often described as 100,000 rivets flying in close formation. It would first see combat in 1957–58, when it was employed as a traditional bomber from the Jebel Akhdar War in Oman, protecting the Sultan and his oil from rebel forces. But this was not the Shackleton's primary role. Designed as an anti-submarine aircraft, the early Shackletons were armed with two 20mm cannons in the nose, and could carry internal bomb loads consisting of torpedoes, bombs, mines, or depth charges. The South African Air Force needed Shackletons to replace their aging short Sunderland flying boats of World War II vintage, and from 1957 received 8 modified MR3s from Britain. They patrolled the sea lanes around the Cape of Good Hope, watching Soviet vessels moving between the Atlantic and Indian Oceans and hunting submarines. Unfortunately, one was lost after crashing into a mountain in bad weather in August 1963, killing all 13 crew. It was also an excellent search and rescue aircraft. All that anti-submarine training would now come into its own, as Shackletons were ordered to bomb up with live depth charges and finally send the Wafra to the bottom before the oil spill became a total disaster. On the 12th of March 1971, the Shackletons made several bombing runs over the SS Wafra. Dropping depth charges accurately. A total of 9 depth charges landed around the Wafra. The explosions caused the Wafra to completely break up and sink in 6,000 feet or 1,800 meters of water, ending the oil slick and preventing any further ecological damage to the South African coastline. The Avro Lancaster's grandson had performed magnificently. The Shackleton would continue to serve the South African Air Force until 1984, when continuing sanctions caused the grounding of the surviving airframes due to a lack of spare parts from Britain and airframe fatigue. However, one Shackleton still remains in the South African Air Force. Pelican 22 no longer flies, but her engines are still run up on occasion. She is probably still flight capable, and today belongs to the South African Air Force Museum. Pelican 22 last flew in March 2008. The museum actually used to have 2 airworthy Shackletons, but in 1994, Shackleton 1716, freshly refurbished, suffered engine failures at night whilst flying to Britain to take part in a series of air shows. It crash-landed in the Sahara Desert near the Mauritanian border, all 19 aboard surviving the ordeal. This aircraft remains in the desert today. As for Royal Air Force Shackletons, they were finally retired from service in 1991. Today, one is being restored to, hopefully, flight status and currently undertakes taxi runs at Coventry Airport, while another has working engines at Gatwick Aviation Museum. Five more Shackletons are on static display in the UK and 2 in South Africa. Another lies in a wrecked condition at Paphos International Airport in Cyprus. And for any American fans watching this, one Avro Shackleton is on display in the US at the Pima Air and Space Museum, Tucson, Arizona. Built in 1952, the Shackleton AEW-2 last flew in 2007. Perhaps one day soon we will see a Shackleton flying alongside its illustrious ancestor, the Lancaster. Thanks for watching, please subscribe and share. And also visit my new audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.